What's going on, everybody? Today we're doing another deep dive, and the topic is going to be on white flight. Yes, this is a topic that I don't know where I got the inspiration to do it, but this is one that I never really touched on. I think I probably did in maybe a passing in a video, but never a full-blown deep dive on what white flight is, where it started at, what it turned into, and possibly, I guess you could say, where it's at right now. So let's go ahead and get into it. White flight is one of the most defining yet often misunderstood phenomenons in modern American history. It shaped the suburbs that we know today, transformed city economies, and left behind social scars that still influence racial and economic divides in America. But how did it start? What drove millions of white Americans to leave the cities they once called home? And what were the long-term consequences of that mass migration? So we're going to take a deep dive into the history of white flight and how its legacy still echoes across the country to this day. To understand white flight, we have to go back to the early 20th century, when America's cities were booming with industry and immigration. The Great Migration saw millions of black Americans move from the rural South to northern and western cities like Chicago, Detroit, and Los Angeles, searching for jobs and freedom from Jim Crow laws. At the same time, white ethnic groups such as the Irish, Italians, and the Polish were already competing for housing and jobs in those urban centers. When black families began moving into once all-white neighborhoods, it triggered panic among many white homeowners, fueled by racism, stereotypes, and economic fears. Real estate agents and banks quickly capitalized on those fears, introducing a new tool that would shape the housing market for generations called redlining. In the 1930s, the federal government's Homeowner Loans Corporation drew up color-coded maps labeling neighborhoods by risk. Areas with black residents were outlined in red, which were deemed too risky for investment. That single policy decision made it almost impossible for black families to get home loans, while white families were encouraged to move into green or blue areas or the newly built suburbs. Meanwhile, restricted covenants, clauses written into deeds, legally barred black people from buying homes in white neighborhoods. This wasn't just social segregation, it was systemic, and it ensured that racial and economic boundaries were locked in place. After World War II, the federal government poured money into housing and infrastructure. Programs like the GI Bill made it easier for white veterans to buy homes, while the Federal Aid Highway Act paved the literal roads to the suburbs. Builders like Levitt & Sons created mass-produced housing developments marketed specifically to white families, safe, affordable, and far from the perceived quote-unquote chaos of the cities. For many white Americans, this was sold as progress, the American dream with the white picket fence. But what it really represented was state-sanctioned segregation on a massive scale. Black veterans, however, despite serving their country, were systematically denied those same benefits due to discriminatory lending and local enforcement. As white families fled to the suburbs, cities were left with shrinking tax bases, crumbling schools, and rising unemployment. Industries followed the migration, relocating factories and offices to suburban areas where the workforce and the customers had gone. By the 1960s and 70s, major cities like Detroit, Cleveland, and St. Louis were hollowing out. What followed were decades of disinvestment, poverty, and tension. And when civil rights movements gained momentum, white flight accelerated even faster, practically like warp speed, sometimes triggered by nothing more than a single black family moving into a white block. Entire neighborhoods could flip within just a few years. White flight didn't just redraw the map of America, it hardened racial and class divisions that persist to this very day. Schools became more segregated than ever, and not by law, but by geography and economics. Property values and funding were directly tied to racial demographics. Suburbs became symbols of opportunity, while inner cities were stigmatized as dangerous and undesirable. Even today, you can trace the lines of white flight in housing prices, school districts, and transportation patterns. And it's not just history, it's an ongoing system built over several generations. In recent decades, there's been a new twist. You might have heard reverse migration, or the more popular one, gentrification. Wealthier, often white residents are moving back into the cities, pushing out long-term black residents through rising rents and property taxes. In a way, it's the same story but flipped. Displacement by economics instead of race on paper, but still tied to the same unequal roots. White flight wasn't just about fear, It was about policy, profit, and power. And it's a constant reminder that segregation didn't just happen. It was very much engineered through maps, mortgages, and mindsets that shape who gets access to opportunity. So when we look at the divide between cities and suburbs, between privilege and poverty, we're not just seeing geography, we're seeing history. White flight didn't end decades ago, it simply evolved. Understanding it isn't about blame, it's about clarity, because if we can trace how we got here, we can start asking better questions about where we go next.